Okay, let's begin, Steve, if I may, with this question. In your first video, we heard a man, Dr. Whitaker, who personally went through a very unsettling, I would even say terrifying, near-death experience.
Dr. Whitaker's case should be unsettling for many out there who may be able to relate to his earlier debauched life of partying, drugs, excess drinking, and more. But even without all that, just living for the big S, the self, without really any thoughts about God or eternity is, I think, enough of a crisis. And the first thing I note is that in his wider testimony story, and you can access it on one of my video selections at the end of this first video of the two-part series here, the doctor was, not searching for anything like a spiritual life change of any kind. No, rather, it was a sudden health crisis and going flatline in intensive care with really only swift medical intervention bringing his vital signs back that just kind of shocked him awake. Horror he'd experienced as he momentarily lay dead in that hospital bed.
So what do you think caused that horror of dying and going all the way, as he referred to it?
The doctor talks like there was no doubt in his mind at all. The terror of dying for this man was knowing that he would plunge into an eternal, in other words, never-ending hell. That's what caused his total reversal of lifestyle. And with the kind prayers and words of encouragement, of course, of his Christian friend, and sharing his faith, there was a near immediate conversion to Christianity in this man's life. Most people, I don't think, Mike, realize this, but Jesus is recorded in the New Testament Gospels as warning us more about hell and its horrors than he did speaking of heaven and its eternal joys and bliss. And I'm going to have more on this incredibly vital and life-changing issue later.
Let me anticipate what some people might say after watching the doctor's story. Maybe Dr. Whitaker's case is just a one-off? Couldn't it be just one man's hallucinatory nightmare? Or does this kind of opposite bright serene tunnel NDE occur more often?
Well, apparently not a one-off at all, or a medication-induced hallucination maybe, or something similar. In fact, on YouTube, under a search topic like near-death hell experiences, you can find any number of videos where people are interviewed about dying and suddenly experiencing an almost indescribable horror as they were pulled toward what they were convinced was eternal hell. But maybe I can save our viewers some time. I spent considerable effort reviewing many of these accounts, and I will tell you that some, to me at least, seem embellished or perhaps even made up just to capture big views on YouTube. It's difficult sometimes to tell, Mike, but with some, because of what is clearly the passionate intensity of what they're reporting, you just get a sense that these are really true eyewitness accounts. And certainly Dr. Whitaker's is one of these, but there are others. And also for those who want a very professional and credible eyewitness account of a number of near-death hellish experiences, cardiologist Dr. Maurice Rawlings, who wrote the book To Hell and Back, is to me among the best documented sources of these situations. He, by the way, spent his earlier life and medical training as an avowed atheist. But what he began to personally experience with some of his patients stunned him. It ultimately radically changed his perspective on death and the afterlife, as he would frantically, in some cases, revive patients that died, had heart attacks on his treadmill during stress testing or other times. And in frantically reviving them, Dr. Rawlings would hear them back to consciousness just screaming. And well, we'll see part of an interview with Dr. Rawlings here later. There's a general definition of a miracle as an event or an experience that is not explainable by any known physical laws that govern our universe. These would be laws as defined and identified, measurable, I guess, by modern science. Well, then I would think people who sincerely, and many with strong emotion, describe their near-death encounters, they just themselves qualify these as some kind of miracle event. But look, I would urge our viewers to not miss this most important, crucial point. The death rate is now and always has been 100%, right? We're all going to be part of that statistic, whether sooner or later.
Yes, at least for those Jesus warned about who are on the broad road leading down to eternal destruction, right?
Yeah, well, that's right, Mike. And we cover the biblical passages about Christ's sudden return and the indescribable joy of that experience for true Christians in videos under the Wake Up and Awakening playlists on my channel here on Upward Live. And you know, it's amazing to me now as I think back how God, I believe, brought me awake 35 years ago. He opened my eyes to just what my life was back then, basically hedonistic, godless, selfish, etc. So I now believe that what Jesus alerted us to in the Bible records is absolute reality. Heaven exists, but as Christ bluntly warned, so does an eternal hell. The word in the original Greek language in which the New Testament was written, meaning eternal, Christ used that word to describe both heaven and hell. They last forever in both cases. So think about it. Secular science defines reality as only that which is measurable. Well, that to me seems very shallow. Most scientists universally reject anything that's unmeasurable by our alleged sophisticated sciences of the day. But rather, I think, as some Christian theologians have suggested, that the reality of the dimension in which God dwells is possibly much more vividly real than this dimension in which we humans are confined to during our physical lives. But miracles, well, those have to be defined, I think, as apparently those rare times when an all-powerful God who created everything out of nothing, Genesis chapter 1, including the physical laws which science clings to, well, this mighty God decides sometimes, it would seem, to suddenly step into this dimension that he also created, of course, by temporarily setting aside the laws that he has made and unexpectedly performs events that we can only call miraculous. I'll be summarizing just a small number of these up ahead.
Aren't miracles impossible because they violate the laws of nature? You hear this a lot from skeptics. In fact, the most famous skeptic of history is David Hume, a Scottish philosopher from the 1700s. And he said miracles are a violation of the laws of nature, so they're not possible. So when God performs a miracle, he's not overturning or invalidating or violating the laws of nature that he himself created. He's merely intervening in his creation. In my book, I spend 2 chapters, and I've talked on this topic here before, but I have an interview with a PhD from UCLA, a physicist, and I spend 2 chapters building the scientific evidence that points toward a supernatural creator of the universe. That Genesis 1 verse 1 is accurate when it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I believe that cosmology and physics back up that claim. And if God is the creator, then of course he can intervene in the world. Timothy Keller put it this way: If a God exists who is big enough to create the universe in all its complexity and vastness, why should a mere miracle be such a mental stretch? How common are miracles today? Now, I interviewed, as I said, Dr. Michael Shermer, editor of Skeptic Magazine, for my book, and Skeptic Magazine had an article that claimed that it's only the, in their words, uneducated and uncivilized who believe in miracles. And yet, get this is maybe the most amazing statistic of all. 55% of physicians in the United States say they have seen an incident in their practice of medicine that they can only explain as being a miracle. 55% of doctors have seen a miracle in their practice. Now, you can't write off doctors as being uneducated and quote-unquote uncivilized. They understand how the human body works. They understand the process of healing and how it usually takes place. They are well educated, and yet a majority of them say, I've seen it in my own practice. Friends, I think miracles occur a lot more often than we might suppose. Now, let me mention this. My opinion is, and I think the research bears this out, the number of miracles around planet Earth are not evenly distributed. There are clusters of miracles that take place, and they generally tend to proliferate in areas where the gospel is just breaking into a new area. So we see this around the world. Outbreaks, spates of miracles breaking out where the gospel is breaking in. So how can we tell if a miracle has occurred? I believe we can reasonably conclude that a miracle occurred if we have solid documentation and multiple and credible eyewitnesses who have no motive to deceive, if there's no alternative natural explanation, and if there's spiritual overtones, for instance, prayer. In fact, science can be used sometimes to point us toward whether or not actual miracles are taking place. I think science is the friend of miracles. Now, I'll give you an example. For my book, I interviewed a woman, PhD from Harvard, who is a professor at a well-respected secular university, Indiana University. She heard about this outbreak of miracles in Mozambique. And so she decided, I'm going to check it out. I'm going to research it. I'm going to use science to try to determine, is something supernatural taking place? So what did she do? She took a team of researchers and scientists to Mozambique, turned over to Christians to be prayed for. And these Christians would lay hands on them, and they would pray for them for 10 minutes up to an hour each. And then, immediately after that, they're scientifically tested again. What is their level of hearing now? What is their level of vision now? And guess what they discovered? Virtually every single one of them improved to one degree or another, often astoundingly so. For instance, there was a woman by the name of Martine. When they tested Martine scientifically, they found that she was incapable of hearing a jackhammer next to her. That's how deaf she was. After 10 minutes of prayer in the name of Jesus Christ, they tested her again. She could hear a normal conversation. Absolutely amazing. How do you account for that? Now, my book talks about lots of documented miracles taking place, but the one that I investigated that absolutely blew me away the most was a woman by the name of Barbara Snyder. I interviewed Barbara at length. We have extensive medical records from her dating back many years from the Mayo Clinic and her other physicians. We have multiple credible eyewitnesses with no motive to deceive. We have two of her doctors who were so blown away by what happened to her, they wrote about it in books. Because they said, I got to write about this, it's unbelievable. So let me tell you what happened to Barbara. Barbara was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at the Mayo Clinic. For the next several years, she just deteriorated, got worse and worse. She had repeated hospitalizations, repeated surgeries, until ultimately she was dying. And they put her in hospice at her home. So she's confined to bed at her home. One of her physicians, Dr. Harold P. Adolph, a board-certified surgeon who had performed 25,000 operations in his career, he called Barbara, quote, one of the most hopelessly ill patients I ever saw. Hopelessly ill. One of her lungs was non-functional. The other was just inflated at 50%. A tube was inserted into her neck and oxygen was pumped from canisters in her garage so she could breathe. She'd lost control of her urination and her bowels. She was legally blind. All she could see were gray shadows. A feeding tube was inserted into her stomach. She hadn't walked in like 7 years, and so her legs had atrophied, her muscles had shrunken, and her legs atrophied, and she was curled up like a pretzel in her bed from her illness. Her hands were flexed so that her fingers were touching her wrists, and her feet were permanently flexed and extended. Her parents met with doctors, and they agreed there's nothing more medically that could be done. And they said the next time she contracts pneumonia, which because of her lung situation, she would contract it on a regular basis, they would not try to revive her because it would just prolong her inevitable death. We know that a minimum of 450 Christians began to pray for Barbara. How do we know? Because they sent letters telling Barbara, we're praying for you. So what happened? I'm going to let Barbara describe to you what happened next.
June 7th, 1981, I'll never forget it. It was a day like any other day for me. That was one spent confined to bed, unable to breathe on my own, hooked up to machines, a tracheostomy tube in my neck, my arms curled up, my legs curled up. I lay there trapped inside my own body is really how it felt.
And there was nobody else in the room.
And there was no one else in the room, and the door was over here, there were windows over this way. I remember reaching up and pulling my oxygen off my neck. I remember that. And then I jumped toward the voice. My friends are over here, but I jumped towards the voice. And as I jumped up, the first thing I remember isn't what I would think I would remember, but I jumped out of the bed, and I looked, and I saw my feet. They were flat on the ground, just like everyone else's, which sounds normal, but not for me. I had foot drops so badly I couldn't even wear slippers on my feet. They were so curled. So when I jumped up to have feet flat, I was amazed and stood staring at my feet. And when I did that, I jumped like this, and then I saw my hands, and they were open, and they never opened. And so now they were open, and I stood staring at them, and then it dawned on me I could see I was well again. And it has to be God. That's all I knew.
Barbara was instantly and thoroughly healed. Her eyesight was immediately restored. Her lungs were immediately back to normal. Her mother came running into the room and fell to her knees and began to feel her calves. She said, your muscles are back. Her muscle tone had returned instantly to her legs so she could walk after 7 years. Her father came in and hugged her and then began waltzing with her around the room. This would be like a voice telling you, get up and fly. And you'd say, well, I can't do that. That's how wild it was for her. Say, get up and walk after all these years. And yet she heard that. How do you explain that? Well, the illness has never come back today. This happened more than 30 years ago. Today, Barbara is married to a pastor, and they have a little church in Fredericksburg, Virginia.
And here's the video on the screen if you want to access this. I'll first summarize a case of an infant who was found unable to digest milk because of a genetic disorder and was in danger of dying due to malnutrition. Doctors quickly operated and placed 2 tubes into his stomach and intestine. As he grew, the boy was actually unable to eat normally and had to take all nutrition through one of the tubes, then the tube in his stomach. But at age 16, a Christian man who had himself miraculously been healed from a near fatal accident years earlier, so he was very zealous about praying, he prayed earnestly over this young man. And the teenager later said that he felt the tubes in his stomach strangely vibrating. And later that evening, he just felt compelled, and so he ate a meal for the first time in his life. Can you imagine that? Well, shortly after that, the surgeons who had examined him decided that his whole digestive tract somehow was now suddenly functioning normally. And subsequently, they surgically removed the tubes. Well, the young man now eats and digests all his meals in a perfectly normal manner. And Dr. Brown was able to gather all the medical records on this case and then had a team of gastroenterologists evaluate the data. The result? Well, they all agreed that this event was remarkable and they saw no known medical way that this could even be possible. I love it when doctors say that. Well, here's a quick summary of another amazing case Dr. Brown and his staff have researched. Although these cases are couched in pretty medically technical language when you read them, you can directly access them by a Google search for the website Global Medical Research Institute. Well, this case involves a young woman diagnosed with a rapid vision loss in both eyes. She was diagnosed with juvenile macular degeneration and was declared legally blind. She suffered with this condition for 12 years. But after family and friends gathered to pray fervently in the name of Jesus over her, she suddenly, and of course miraculously, regained her eyesight. Well, since then, her eyesight has been normal, fine for reading, driving, living for over 40 years since her healing. And this one was also carefully researched by Dr. Brown and Mrs. Brown. Now, also, Mike, many of these incidents of just inexplicable, we'll say miraculous healings, a number of those I've reviewed are just overwhelming when you really think about the implications of what's being reported here.
I assume you mean what strikes me about these two, that it's hard for those of us out here who are distanced from the actual events to really understand the impact of a sudden, dramatic, and unexpected reversal of serious medical conditions into near instantaneous, perfect health. What a shock to the emotions, and overwhelming joy to the patient and those closest to them that must be.
Yeah, I can hardly imagine the shock and awe to those involved with this kind of unexpected, involved in this kind of unexpected drama. There have been medical professionals who were impacted so tremendously by a healing that they observed, like we've described here, that they've actually had a change of heart and have now accepted Christianity, coming to faith, believing that Jesus Christ was in fact the Savior, Healer, Redeemer, Son of God, the Bible records so vividly.
Thanks, Steve, for helping us delve into these issues of encounters with something clearly supernatural, and without the standard scientific explanations. I know they are so numerous that we can't begin to do them justice here, so we'll close off this particular video. But if you're still with us and feel led to know more about the miraculous and what that implies about your life now and in eternity, then we urge you to tap on the final video in this short series to learn more about stunning encounters some people have experienced on the very knife edge of life and death.